Normandy, October 1944. The square of Saint-Omer-les-Vernes had not seen a market day in 3 years. The fountain was dry. The cobblestones were cracked where a tank had crossed them 2 weeks before, and nobody had bothered to pretend things were normal since. Standing in the middle of it, alone, was a boy. He was 20 years old. He was wearing a Cameron Highlanders tunic, a green and black tartan kilt, and the particular expression of a man who has been pointed at before and found it instructive. Oberstleutnant Werner Falk had 50 armed soldiers, 30 years of military experience, and a Walther P-38 he had just drawn and aimed at the boy's forehead from 3 feet away. He gave the order every soldier is trained to obey without thinking: surrender. The boy looked at the gun. Then he looked at Falk. Then, slowly, with the calm of a man who already knows how this ends, he smiled. What happened in the next 45 seconds would leave 50 German soldiers, with their rifles on the cobblestones, and one Wehrmacht colonel wondering exactly when he had lost control of the situation. Stay. This story earns it. His name was Alistair Drum, and the first thing you need to understand about him is that he was not supposed to be there. Not in France. Not in that square. Not in any theater of the Second World War technically. Because when he walked into a recruitment office in Inverness in the spring of 1940 and added 2 years to his age, the British Army had no idea it was enlisting a 16-year-old shepherd's son from the north coast of Scotland, who had never been further from home than Thurso. They found out eventually. They kept him anyway. The second thing you need to understand is the kilt. It was not an accident, and it was not sentiment. Drum wore it in the field for the same reason a poker player keeps his face still, because in a game where everyone is reading everyone else for weakness, the man who looks like he isn't playing the game at all holds a particular kind of power. A boy in a military tunic reads as a soldier. A boy in a kilt reads as a story. And in occupied France, where the resistance fighters who crept out to meet him had survived 4 years of occupation and had earned the right to trust no one, being a story was the fastest route to being believed. They believed him. The Germans noticed him faster. Within 3 weeks of his arrival in the Loire Valley, a Wehrmacht intelligence report had flagged an SOE irregular operating in the Saint-Omer sector, young, Scottish, conspicuously dressed, accompanied by a small Maquis, and responsible for 2 disrupted supply convoys, and one very confused garrison that had spent an entire night, convinced it was surrounded by a force 4 times larger than the 4 people it actually was. There was no bounty on his head. He was not yet important enough for that. He was about to become important enough for that. Because Oberstleutnant Falk's column, 50 men, orders to clear the Saint-Omer road and secure the river bridge, was 40 minutes ahead of schedule. And the boy in the square with his cold coffee and his kilt and his grandfather's dirk on his belt had not planned for 40 minutes early. What he did with those 45 seconds is the whole story. Sutherland in winter is not a place that produces soft men. The wind comes off the North Sea, without manners and without warning, and the sheep on the Drum family's 40 acres didn't care what the temperature was when they needed moving. Alistair was the second of 4 children, which meant he was old enough to work, before he was old enough to argue about it, and young enough that nobody thought to ask whether he minded. He didn't mind. That was the thing about him even then. His father, Connell, had come back from the Somme in 1918 with both legs and nothing else intact. He farmed. He was fair. He did not speak about France, not once. Not ever. Not in 16 years of Alistair watching him for it. His grandfather, Yuan, spoke about nothing else. On the long evenings when the wind pressed against the cottage walls like it had somewhere to be, Yuan would talk, not about glory, not about victory, about the weight of a decision made in 4 seconds that a man carries for 40 years, about what it costs to be still when everything in you is screaming to move. Alistair listened to every word. In the spring of 1940, he walked into a recruitment office in Inverness, added 2 years to his age, and did not blink once. Nobody checked. The army needed boys. The riverbed outside Medjez El Bab was dry and white and offered nothing to hide behind. The ambush took 30 seconds. 3 men from Drum's unit were dead before anyone had properly understood what was happening. He was 19 years old, flat in the dirt with his hands behind his head, and a German allied Italian rifleman was standing over him with a weapon that was shaking very slightly at the barrel end. That detail stayed with him, the shaking. They marched him and 2 others to a holding camp near Tebessa. Wire, dust, a smell like diesel and old boots. The guards were young. Most of them were frightened of the desert, the same way the prisoners were frightened of the wire, and Drum spent the first 3 days doing nothing but watching them. How they held themselves at shift change. Which one talked too much when he was nervous? Which one wanted badly to be somewhere else? On the 4th day, he started talking to a Sicilian prisoner in the next cell, learning enough Italian to be dangerous. On the 8th day, he told his guard, in passable Italian, that he had information about British troop movements that needed to reach the right officer immediately. The guard believed him, not because the story was airtight, because he wanted it to be true. Drum walked out of the front gate and did not run until the camp was out of sight. The raid near Sino failed because of him. There was no other honest way to say it. He had moved the team 40 minutes too early, misread a patrol rotation he had watched for 2 days and thought he understood. The Germans were where they weren't supposed to be. In the scramble that followed, 3 men took wounds. Fernie, a corporal from Dundee, most seriously, a bullet through the meat of his thigh that would keep him off his feet for 2 months. Drum was recaptured. The others got out. The camp outside Naples was not brutal. That almost made it worse. There was time to think, which was the one thing he did not want. 6 weeks of it. 6 weeks of replaying the patrol rotation, the timing, the moment he had decided he knew enough when he didn't. He replayed Fernie going down. He replayed the decision that put Fernie there. He did not decide in that camp to be braver. Bravery had never been his problem. He decided to be slower, to watch longer, to treat certainty the way his grandfather had taught him to treat ice on the high ground, as something that required testing before you put your weight on it. He went through the wire on a wet November night, flat on his stomach in the mud, unhurried. He had somewhere to be. He was going to get there right. Odette Voss ran her resistance cell out of a bakery on the Rue des Fossés, and the bread was genuinely excellent. She was 38, small, and had the particular stillness of a woman who had already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing. Her husband, Patrice, had been shot in the street outside their school in March 1941. For reasons the Germans never formally explained. She had kept teaching. She had kept baking. She had kept passing information through a network that stretched from Orléans to the Fé River, and she had buried 3 cell members in 4 years and not stopped once. When Drum arrived, she looked at him the way she looked at everything, as a problem to be assessed rather than a person to be welcomed. She taught him sound. Irregular rhythm in gunfire, she explained, reads as multiple weapons rather than one. A voice positioned at the far end of a building and echoed off a wall becomes 2 voices at distance. An engine revved twice behind a tree line suggests vehicles that are not there. 4 people, handled correctly in the dark, sound like a platoon to men whose fear is already filling in what their eyes cannot confirm. Drum listened without writing any of it down. He never asked her to repeat anything. Odette would say later, to the Maquis commander who asked for her assessment, that Drum was the best student she had encountered in 4 years of teaching people how to stay alive. She said it without warmth. That was the most accurate kind of compliment she knew. The message came through Rémy at 9:30 on a Tuesday, written on the back of a flower receipt in Odette's handwriting. Hold Saint-Omer-les-Vernes. 6 hours. Do not let the column reach the bridge. Drum read it twice, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket. The village was a square, a fountain, 1 road in and 1 road out, and approximately 400 civilians who had been pretending to be invisible for years and deserved to keep pretending. The German column was 50 men under an officer named Falk, experienced, moving with purpose, expected to reach Saint-Omer sometime the following morning. Drum's force was Rémy, who was reliable, Bernard, who was brave and occasionally impulsive, which was a combination that required management, Theo, who was 17 and had a rifle he had never pointed at a living person, and Celeste, Odette's niece, who handled the radio with the focus competence of someone who understood exactly what the transmission was worth and intended to finish it. 5 people, 50 soldiers, 6 hours. He had escaped a Tunisian prison camp with a sentence of Italian and someone else's confidence. He had gone through German wire in the rain with nothing but patience. He looked at the flower receipt again. The arithmetic was familiar. He had worked with worse. They worked through the night without speaking more than necessary. Rémy knew which oil drums to use. There were 4 behind the mill, deep-sided, that would catch a gunshot and throw it across the square like a stone off water. They positioned them with corrugated iron angled at the back walls of the buildings on the north and east sides, creating a channel that would make one rifle firing from the fountains sound like three firing from different positions. It took 2 hours to get the angles right. Drum tested each one with a hand clap until Rémy, crouching by the east wall, held up a fist. Good enough. Bernard buried the grenade at the road's choke point, 18 inches down, rigged with a trip line so fine it was nearly invisible in daylight and entirely invisible in dark. One shot at the column's lead vehicle, one moment of chaos to reset the arithmetic. They rehearsed the movements until Bernard stopped hesitating on the turn by the fountain. At 2 in the morning, the others slept and Drum walked the square alone. He stood at the fountain. He stood at the gate. He stood in the spot where he calculated Falk would stand when he entered, and worked out the exact angle of every sight line from every position. He was not asking God for anything. He had never found that useful. He was working, the way his grandfather had worked a hillside, slow, methodical, learning the ground before the ground became the problem. By 3, he knew the square the way he knew his own hands. He sat down and waited for morning. The fog had not lifted by 7, which was the one thing that had gone according to plan. Drum was standing at the fountain with a cup of coffee that had been hot 20 minutes ago when he heard the car. One engine, not the sound of a column, just a single vehicle coming slowly down the road from the north. He did not move. He took another sip and watched the gate. Falk came through it on foot, his adjutant 2 paces behind. He stopped when he saw Drum. Drum watched him process it. The uniform, the kilt, the absolute absence of alarm, and then watched him make the decision to keep walking forward. They stood 12 feet apart. Neither spoke for 30 seconds. Drum counted them. Then Falk reached into his coat and drew the Walther with the practiced ease of a man who had done it many times and found it settled most. Conversations. The safety disengaged with a sound that was very small and very clear in the foggy quiet of the square. He extended his arm. The barrel was level with Drum's forehead. The cobblestones were cold. The fog moved slowly between them. Somewhere behind the mill, Drum knew. Rémy had heard the car and was already in position. He looked at the gun. He looked at Falk's hand around it. The finger was alongside the trigger guard, not on it. He looked up at Falk's face and understood, with the certainty of a man who had been reading frightened people since Tunisia, exactly what was in front of him. He smiled, not at the gun, at the calculation he had just completed. Drum set his coffee cup on the edge of the fountain. He did not reach for his weapon. He did not step back. He looked at Falk with the unhurried attention of a man reading a page he has read before, and he spoke one sentence in German, quietly, the way you tell someone something they already know, but haven't finished thinking through yet. Ihre Kolonne steht noch 2 Kilometer zurück, und Sie sind allein. Your column is still 2 kilometers back, and you are alone. It was not a threat. It was a fact. Falk's fact, stated plainly, by a man who should not have known it and did. Which meant this boy had been watching the road, which meant he was not alone, which meant the empty square was not what it appeared to be. Drum watched Falk's finger. It did not move toward the trigger. Then Rémy stepped out from the north alley, Bernard from the east. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Theo fired the acoustic rig. The sound that came off the oil drums and the iron and the walls of Saint-Omer-les-Vernes was not the sound of 3 people. It was the sound of a village that had been waiting, armed, and was no longer waiting. Rifles from the north. Rifles from the east. A burst from somewhere behind the mill that could have been anything. And in Falk's position was certainly a machine gun. Falk turned back. His arm came down. He said one word to his adjutant. The adjutant spoke into the radio. 2 kilometers back, 50 men heard the order, and the rifles came off shoulders and went onto the road. It had taken, by Drum's count, less than a minute. The coffee was still warm. Drum organized the prisoner column the way he organized everything. Methodically, without theater. He sent Bernard to the road to receive the rifles. He sent Rémy for the Maquis cell at the farmhouse 2 kilometers east, who arrived within the hour in sufficient number to make the situation permanent. He checked on Celeste, who was still at the radio in the back room of the Mairie, headphones on, fingers moving, entirely undisturbed by the fact that 50 German soldiers had just surrendered in the square outside her window. She finished the transmission 11 minutes later, removed her headphones, and said nothing because there was nothing necessary to say. Then Drum sat back down at the fountain. The coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. He did not speak for a long time, and nobody asked him to. 2 days later, Odette came. She sat across from him at the bakery table and asked him what he had said to Falk. He told her, the German, the one sentence, the fact delivered as though it were already settled. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was the right thing to say, but that not everyone could have said it, because not everyone would have been right. And being wrong by 1 degree, she said, in that square, with that man, would have been the end of everything. The transmission, the village, him. He nodded. He knew. That was the weight of it. Not the victory, the margin, how thin it had been, how much had to have been true about him before that one sentence could work. Every camp, every escape, every night on a cold hillside learning to read a situation before it read him. He had been right this time. He picked up his cup, found it empty, and set it down. Outside, the fog had finally lifted.